But my name's Charlie Toledo. I live in Napa Valley, Napa, California, in the territory of the Patwin, the Coast Miwok, and the Onisati people, the unceded territories of the tribes of this region. I'm the executive director of Sasko Intertribal Council since 1992. I've also been on the governing board of Women's Intercultural Network since 1996. We went to Beijing in 1995, and that's where I started to encounter WIN. The executive director, Marilyn Fowler, I want to acknowledge her and her work. She actually took Apple Computer in 1995 to Beijing so that the people, the women and the children that were participating in that international conference, we could report about ourselves. And in 1995, this technology of email was very, very new. So it was a very visionary action. She contacted Apple. Apple got all the computers set up. There was a whole huge multimedia room. It was the first time that had ever been done at the UN. That was Marilyn Fowler at the UNCSW, the International Women's Fifth World Conference. At that Beijing conference, it was so important because the women of the world, 30,000 women from all over the world gathered in Wairau in Beijing. And that was the first time that human rights got clearly defined in 13 points. And one of the critical things that got added as a human right was climate, access to clean water, access to clean air, access to safety for women and children in their homes, their workplace, their schools, their streets. So it really clearly defined what is now referred to as the millennial goals, and the whole world is working to bring and guarantee human rights for women and children. Under the charismatic leadership of Marilyn Fowler, but it has become a global team of visionary women committed to bringing the global local, because on international levels, we have these esoteric goals, but it takes a lot of work to actually bring that down to the village, the town, or the city where you live in. And so now we have this global network through Women's Intercultural Network that Marilyn Fowler created after the 1996, after the Beijing conference. She had an incredible instinct for capacity and capacity to identify leader women and children. And she brought together women of all ages, ethnicities from around the world to work collectively for human rights for women and children. She organized delegations to China, to Uganda, to Afghanistan, Japan, the Philippines, and across the United States. We collectively continue her amazing leadership. She inspired the creation of US Women Connect and US Women Caucuses, other organizations with dynamic presence at this UNCSW 66. There's, I think, almost 7 panels that are hosted and inspired by her leadership. So I'm going to give the microphone over to Marianne. She's going to be our moderator today.
Good afternoon, good evening, everybody. I am Marianne. I'd first like to take a moment to acknowledge the original inhabitants of the land I currently reside on. For thousands of years, this land has been the home to the Patwin people, including the Yochadihi Winton tribe today. The Patwin people have remained committed to the stewardship of this land over many centuries. It has been cherished and protected as elders have instructed the young through generations. I am honored and grateful to be here today on their traditional lands. Thank you for coming, everybody. I am originally from Oklahoma. I'm currently living in California's San Francisco Bay Area, about an hour south of Charlie. I'm a board member on the Women's Intercultural Network. Previously, I've served on the Vallejo Intertribal Council, now called the Seven Generations Intertribal Council, and the Indian Health Center of Santa Clara Valley boards. Since elementary school, I have worked to improve knowledge about my Native American people through communication and dispelling the all too common misconceptions and myths. Since 2020, I was first a co-chair and now an advisory member of the Racial Equity and Hunger National Learning Network, sharing information and practices on how to disrupt racism. Today, together with my husband, Ben, I help run Faith Food Fridays, a nonprofit free food pantry in the city of Vallejo, California. We serve hundreds of families a week with free, nutritious, fresh, and non-perishable foods, along with efforts aimed at food justice and food sovereignty. And now I'd like to turn the microphone over to Carmen Gonzalez.
Thank you so much. My name is Carmen Gonzalez. I wanted to start by taking a moment to give gratitude for the dreams my ancestors dreamt, for the beautiful future they wished for me and for all of us to live in. I believe my mother intended to be in this talk today, so I hope she's able to see this, and I want to give thanks to my mom for putting up with me and raising me and teaching me the most important things in this world. And that feeds the work I do today. And I want to keep in mind the people who are living in conflict in the world right now, and may there be peace. And for all those who are suffering with uncertainty, with inflation, and struggling to make ends meet, may we all remember why we're doing the work that we're doing here today, and keep the faces of those that we love in our mind as we do this work. So I live in Las Vegas, Nevada, and I want to acknowledge the land I'm living on is the Nuwu, that's Southern Paiute people, and the tribes that allow me to do the work that I do here in Nevada are the Numa, the Northern Paiute, the Niue, the Shoshone, and the Washoe tribes. I've been working in environmental science for over 20 years. I've worked with tribes in Nevada and Eastern Sierras in California, managing environmental quality programs. The work I've been involved in includes monitoring air and water quality, conducting environmental sampling and laboratory analysis for ground and surface water, and working on cleanup and mitigation projects for contaminated sites. Currently, my work is focused on helping rural and disadvantaged communities get access to clean drinking water. My work has been completely transformed by the vision of permaculture. When I began my career, I diligently worked on conducting scientific studies and collecting data and publishing reports that I'm not sure anyone read. And every year, the quality of the environment I was studying got worse. And after a decade of seeing declines in every single parameter I was looking at, I became very depressed. I feel like the world's problems are so huge sometimes, and I was just feeling very ineffective and helpless to do anything in the world to help. And then I went to a class that Penny held. It was a permaculture class, and on day 2 of the class, I learned that there are solutions. In college, I learned all about problems, and we never once really talked about solutions, practical solutions. What can we actually do? And everything I've learned in permaculture was totally new to me. And I was a so-called expert in the water field. So since then, I've devoted myself to learning from the people in this world who are implementing real world solutions to the issues we're facing, from water and drought to food sovereignty and security, and building healthy soils, and even grazing of livestock. So there's so many solutions. So it's my goal to spend the rest of my life learning and practicing and teaching them.
Thank you, Carmen. Next, we'll hear from Penny Livingston.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, thank you for inviting me to be on this panel. I live on the traditional lands of the Snohomish people in Northwestern Washington, and I give a lot of gratitude to the ancestors of this land that have held this land in such a good way that I'm able to live here. So I've been invited to be on this panel largely because of my work in permaculture education. I've been invited into a number of tribal communities, South Dakota, California, the Bishop Paiute Food Sovereignty Program, as well as invited into different circles around the Rights of Mother Earth conference that was held at Haskell University. And these circles, one was in Hawaii with Indigenous elders talking about the adaptability of Indigenous people in relationship to climate change. So as a permaculturist, I'm committed to help support humanity to return to the quality of relationship that Indigenous people have held forever with the earth and with all of creation. It's my dream. And I believe it's the dream of the ancestors that all peoples wake up and start creating solutions to restore this earth, this beautiful garden planet. So we also adopt many Indigenous practices for ecosystem restoration and developing a deep relationship with Mother Earth. So we're in deep alignment, I'll just speak for myself. I'm in deep alignment with Indigenous peoples all over the world. And during 2020, the pandemic, I got stuck in Peru for 10 months. I couldn't leave. And I've been deemed by the Quechua elders there, a Quechua word is called chacaruna, which means bridge person. And they deemed me a chacaruna because I straddle many different cultures and different worlds. So that's a little bit about me.
Thank you so much, Penny. Well, as you can see, we have great experts and we're going to hear from them in just a moment. I did want to give a shout out to our tech team that's helping us today. With us today, we have Robin Denny and Millennia Herve. You may hear from them later on as we go through the process. What's going to happen is we're going to have first a panel discussion. I'm going to ask a series of questions and each panelist will answer. And then after that, we'll have the Q&A. So be thinking of questions you want to ask of our experts. And then we'll close out with some positivity. So kicking it off right now, can't wait to get started. The first question for our panelists is, how is the Native American perspective different in relationship to the earth? And specifically, can you speak to how it regards climate change? Let's hear from Penny first.
Oh, okay, thank you. Well, I distinguish like Indigenous perspective with Western industrialized culture, is what I'm calling the Eurocentric culture. So it's different, it's very different because the Indigenous people have a deep relationship with Mother Earth and all of creation. And by every definition of what a mother provides for her children, Mother Earth provides for us. And I believe that this is a profound difference. And in that Rights of Mother Earth conference, it was a 3-day conference, and as we're peeling away the layers of the onion, it really came down to worldview that was different. Like, how do we get these people to start really understanding that what they call resources, we call relatives. And that's one thing. And then also just in the prophecies, there's been many times, many worlds that have been destroyed in prophecies from all over the world, and not prophecies, but creation stories, I guess. So often they're by floods and volcanoes. Never has it been at our own hands, and so we're now in what we call the fourth world, and we're really being forced to evolve or die. And these prophecies also include the possibility of people rising up, all peoples coming together to work together to heal the earth and to bring peace on this earth and bring back the water and restore the ecosystems and clean the waters and help the waters run free again and create habitat for wildlife while providing for the needs of humans, for us, while providing for our needs. So how can we provide for our needs in a way that isn't poisoning everything and destroying everything and extracting? So, and this has been the Indigenous way since the beginning of time. So as permaculturists, we look to the elders and to the native Indigenous traditional people to learn from them and their ways of how to live in a good way on this earth. And I have been blessed to have many beautiful, wonderful Indigenous teachers who have taught me how to conduct myself on this planet in relationship with creation. So so I just hold a vision of being able to develop a sense of kinship and reciprocity towards all of the human and non-human world. So.
Thank you so much, Penny. And now let's hear from Charlie. Charlie.
Thank you, Mary Ann. I think the primary difference between the Native American worldview from the industrialized perspectives is that we perceive Mother Earth as a living being, just as Penny said. We see the tree people, the rock people, the winged ones, the four-leggeds. All life is connected. The rivers, the seas, there's only one water. There's a web of life that extends all around the earth, through the sun, through the solar system, and it carries us as we travel through the star nations, or what we call the cosmos. We do not look to the natural world, to the web of life as an extractive product, but ourselves as the stewards, the caretakers as an integral part of this amazing, beautiful gift that the Mother Earth gives us everything that we need, and our job is to help care for that. That's it. Simple and sweet.
Thank you, Charlie. And now, Carmen, what is your take on this question?
Thank you. I want to acknowledge what Penny said about entering the fourth world and living in a time that we haven't seen before. I believe it was just the other day that one of our close friends, Uncle John McKaywa, was talking about entering the fourth world. And so we have sort of turned the page and are living in a time that we have never known before. And Indigenous people still live in very close relationship with the cycles of nature. So it's not just something that we had in the past as a part of our way of life, but something that we continue to this day for many Native people. Some of the tribes I've worked with here in Nevada, like the Paiute and the Shoshone, have been living and raising families in the same place for several thousand years. And some people think maybe up to 10,000. And in some parts of this country, much more than that. So that's a lot of deep knowledge and relationship over generations with a single place. So the way of life has always been completely dependent on paying extremely close attention to changes that are happening through the seasons and over many years. Native people have co-evolved with plants and animals in their homes, and also the landscapes that they live in. They really are our relatives in a very real way, not just a theoretical story, but we have co-evolved with each other. And we still have those relationships. And by every part of the way of life, I mean hunting and gathering for food and fishing, prayer and ceremony that honors the earth, and also the passing on of knowledge. There's a term that we use a lot right now called traditional ecological knowledge. And this knowledge is passed on through oral tradition. And I also believe sometimes through things like rock art, the documenting of the elements of nature and passing of time is something we've been doing as original scientists for a very long time in this place. And these days in our modern world, some people live their entire life totally disconnected from nature, totally out of harmony with what's really going on in our world. And Indigenous people to this day tend to live much closer to the land and still respect and honor nature, not as a thing, but like Penny was saying, as a relative, because we did co-evolve together. So we refer to the animal beings as brothers and sisters. And even the elements like the wind and the sun are thought of as members of the family. And sometimes in some tribes, even as holy beings. And like Charlie mentioned, the star nations, if you want to call that the outer space, our depth of relationship extends infinitely out, and we're completely interconnected with everything. So when we care for the natural world around us, we care for it like we would care for our own family members. And right now, maybe for our own family members that are sick with a fever. So that's why I feel like it's absolutely critical for Native American people to have a seat at the table when discussions are happening about climate change and adaptation. We come with valuable traditional ecological knowledge and solutions that can help all of us as we focus on addressing this global issue.
Thank you so much, Carmen. Beautiful. We do have a lot of knowledge in our peoples. So on to question number 2. This question is, what impacts do you see in the Native American communities from climate change? And specifically describe people-oriented impacts. And this time, I think we'll start with Charlie.
Yeah, it's hard to start. Thank you, Marianne. And that was beautiful, Carmen. I just love listening to Carmen. It's like so fresh. The Native Americans were forcibly relocated or forcibly assimilated all through the United States, but especially in California at the harshest genocides. In California, we're still in the early stages of recovery from the European invasions. The people were forcibly removed from their water and food sources after tens of thousands of years. And like Carmen said, here in California, and actually specific to Napa Valley, is one of the oldest continuously inhabited places in North America. And through some of our elders, we have oral traditions that reach back 30,000 years. So all that got displaced with the Euro contact, and that was a little bit more than 100 years ago in California. So the Native American children were taken into boarding schools, over 500 boarding schools in the United States after the genocides and the forced relocations. The children were taken. That's further trauma to the Native people. So when we're talking about climate change for Indigenous people, climate change started in the 1800s and the 1400s for us. The impacts have hit the current climate change that we're seeing is hitting the Native American community hard because they were pushed to marginalized lands. They were pushed there on what are referred to as rancherias and reservations in California. They were put there to die. They were literally deserts, many of them, where food and water were scarce, if existed at all. The substandard food that Native Americans were forced to survive on created health risks that are still being felt really dramatically within the Indian communities. Chronic diseases like diabetes, high blood pressure, obesity, substance abuse, and sky-high rates of suicide and lateral violence. Lateral violence is people who've been so impacted with trauma that when you see people that look like you kind of spread the trauma to them. So that's lateral violence, people kind of beating up on each other, which is really a difficult problem to deal with still now. So now tribes and tribal people are in recovery. And Susquehanna tribal living in Napa County, we're at the forefront of that recovery to regain culture, language, to develop the forest management skills that we have in our ancestral knowledge, to create water conservation techniques and sustainable leadership. Native people are answering the call to return the ancestral knowledge of the earth and turn ourselves back into the role of earth stewards, earth caregivers for the future generations and for all of the two-leggeds on this earth. Susquehanna Tribal behind me in the picture is a land base that we purchased in 1998. We had a collective vision. I was kind of the point person on that vision to create. This was in 1989, maybe. Had the vision to create a land base that was a safe place for Native American people to gather in ceremony. In 1998, we purchased 20 acres in Napa Valley that we've been since then converting into a prototype, kind of converting back to a traditional village. Behind me is our ceremonial arbor. It's a living arbor. We've planted it with cedar trees, the cedar people, our cedar brothers and sisters. They grew from seed that were in my yard. So they've been nurtured, and the arbor will slowly, gradually, as the poles, the ceremonial poles decompose, the trees will continue. It's a place that we commune with the earth and with the star people. Summer solstice especially, many of us have had incredible experiences where the stars actually come, they're called down as a Europe people. I had experienced this one summer solstice where the stars were spinning in a circle in the sky, and I thought, oh, I'm hallucinating. But about 2 weeks later, I was up in Humboldt County, and the Yurok women were sharing with us how once the European invasions happened, the first people killed were the women. And the last people in the tribes in Northern California, they're a little further ahead than we are here in the San Francisco Bay Area as far as their cultural recovery. But she said the last people to claim back their culture were the women. That this one woman felt called to go out and fast and to remember the songs. And she started remembering the songs and hearing the stories of her grandmothers, how them women would go at summer solstice and with their singing and their clapper sticks, which are these sticks that sound like the grass blowing in the wind, really, really soft rattle and soft songs. And they sing the stars down from the sky. And she described exactly where I saw those stars spinning, that they come down and dance in a circle. And after 3 days of dancing with the stars, then they sing the stars back up to the cosmos. So I felt really fortunate to have experienced that and then to hear the story just a few weeks later. And that's that kind of us sometimes inadvertently accessing our ancestral knowledge. And I'm just gonna stop there because I want to stop on that really high level of connectedness to solution.
Thank you so much, Charlie, for that beautiful, beautiful vision. Next, let's hear from, how about Carmen Gonzalez. Impacts on Native American community.
Thank you. I want to acknowledge what you talked about, Charlie. Some of these impacts, they're not just in the environment, they're in us. And yeah, I want to acknowledge the impact on mental health. I have struggled a lot in my life with depression and generational trauma. And these are also the impacts of climate change that we're experiencing in this world. And I want to focus on food, talk about food a bit. Some of the impacts for the tribes that I've been working with here in Nevada are focused on food and having access to traditional foods that they got through hunting, fishing, foraging. Many tribal people still access a lot of their food in this way. It's called subsistence communities and populations. And there are communities that a great majority of the food still comes from the traditional ways of hunting, gathering, fishing, foraging. And here in the Great Basin in Nevada, a huge part of the tradition is pine nutting in the fall. The tribes get together and go pine nutting. And I've had the pleasure to be invited to go out and collect the pine nuts and get very sappy. And, it's a wonderful time and a gathering with the community. There's a pine nut festival up in northern Nevada. And the families travel to the same place in the mountains every year and gather pine cones. And it's a big part of the tradition and a big part, a staple of the diet. And the pine trees have been impacted by climate change. Well, not just by climate change, by several things. And that's one of the things I want to highlight is more than one thing has been happening. So in the case of the pine trees, due to climate change, there have been changes in the rainfall and the snow regime. Sometimes there's more rain at certain parts of the year. Sometimes there's less. Everything's getting kind of wonky in the water cycle. And that has weakened the trees. And So the trees have been dealing with a pine beetle infestation because the trees are weakened. They're susceptible to pests that they wouldn't have been susceptible to before. And that is killing a lot of the pine trees. It can take 100 years for a pine tree to be able to bear fruit, to bear pine cones. So the trees that we're losing now, if we were to go out and replant and help the trees get reestablished, it would be another 100 years before we gather pine nuts from them again. And then on top of that, there's been commercial over-harvesting of the trees to sell pine nuts by corporations. And so this cumulative effects of climate change and our relationship to nature is having a huge impact. The Paiutes people here call themselves for the food they eat. They name themselves after the food they eat. And that's something that I think is kind of unique among tribes. So for example, there are the Doi Taketa, which are the cattail eaters. There's Kuiwi Taketa, that's up in Pyramid Lake, and they eat a fish called kuiwi, which is this rather ugly fish, and they like to eat it. And Tabusi Taketa is another one, and it's grass nut eaters. And there's a lot of different Paiute people named for the foods that they eat. Well, for the Tabusi Taketa, there is no longer Tabusi. That grass no longer grows on the land that the people live on. So what happens when the food that your people are named for is no longer there? These tribal people have lived in the same place for millennia, and they're not going to just pick up and move on and rename themselves. We're talking really about the culture and the identity of the caretakers of the land disappearing because of climate change. I worked on a project with the Doi Taketa, the cattail eater people, the Doi Taketa Community Project. And this ties back to, discussion came up about the boarding schools and residential schools and the traumatic impact that's had. I was working on this project in this community, and at one point, the tribal elders came out and helped to build. We were building cold frames to be able to help grow some food in the winter time and extend the growing season of other foods. And the elders came out and the kids came out and we ate food and everyone had a really good time. The elders, because they had a experience with quilting, knew how to build this cold frame just intuitively. And at the end, I don't want to cry. At the end, one of the elders told me, we haven't done this since before we went to boarding school. And that's when it dawned on me that this is how we heal. Remembering the ways of life that we had before they were interrupted and practicing them again. So when we have to think about climate, when we think about climate change, we have to remember that it's not just one piece impacting the world that we live in. There's this matrix of causes, and that includes how we're managing the land and how we're relating to the land over time. But the change starts in redefining what kind of relative we want to be to Mother Earth, and we can do that.
Thank you, Carmen. And now Penny. You're muted.
Thank you, Carmen. Yeah, I really learned a lot from Carmen actually about the impact of displacement on mental health. And it's a largely unacknowledged situation. But what I wanted to kind of say here is that, many indigenous communities have throughout the world have been living at the forefront of ecosystem destruction in the form of mining and logging and these other extractive practices, clear cutting, by multinational corporations. And so not only have they been displaced, but they've been displaced to these areas where there's a lot of pollution, and so many of the species and food resources are affected by climate change. There are also important cultural elements, as Carmen was talking about, which is an integral to the identity and cohesion of the people. And they've been indigenous people have been disproportionately impacted by climate change, even though they're not the cause of it. And I've been a witness to indigenous people since from growing up, that they've been the lonely message talking about, we need to take care of Mother Earth. I mean, this is where I got all of those teachings as a young woman. It wasn't from white people, it was from indigenous people sharing this wisdom. And so it's ironic that, they're the ones that are suffering the most, even though they're the ones that have been trying their hardest to stop this destruction. And so they're on the front lines to save the land and the water and the air. And also, some of my indigenous friends are regarding climate change as a messenger. Like it's a wake-up call to remind us to stop breaking creation. There's so many examples. Like, I think of Western industrialized culture trying to be like God by thinking they can somehow manipulate creation or improve nature or take from nature, and like extract oils and minerals from the ground and dam rivers and clear cut forests and all this, and not suffer any consequences from that. Of the 500, and I just did a little research on this one, and like 567 federally recognized tribes in the United States, 40% of them, like 229 tribes, live in Alaska. And that's my timer. And they're experiencing this rapid pace of rising temperatures, melting ice and glaciers and thawing permafrost. And they're really seriously being affected by climate change. And I guess it's just the indigenous health is based on interconnected social and ecological systems that are being disrupted by this changing climate. And its impacts threaten sacred sites, threaten practices and relationships with cultural, spiritual, and ceremonial importance that are the foundation of indigenous peoples' cultural heritage and identities and physical and mental health. And so, yeah, they're being seriously impacted. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. I think each one of you brought something to light that maybe people hadn't heard of before, or had maybe forgotten. It really was enlightening to me. Okay, so for the next question, here it is. Can you speak to any adaptations in the Native American communities due to colonizing or Euro invasions for the past 500 years? And Carmen, I will start with you.
Thank you. Wow. I think we really have to keep in mind that indigenous people are the masters of adaptation. It's, I mentioned this before, but it's thought by some tribes that have been, tribes have been living here on Turtle Island for 10,000. There's a new number, maybe 20,000. Charlie said 30,000 years of oral tradition. A very long time, possibly much longer. And the world looked different back then. Here in Nevada, about 12,000 years ago, the ancient Lake Lahontan was at its peak size. This was a ginormous lake. Nevada did not look like a desert 12,000 years ago or so. You can, if you go to Fallon, there's a beautiful wetland there called Stillwater. And this is where the tribe used to live. And in Stillwater, if you go kayaking out there, which I love to do, you can look around and kind of see the bathtub ring of the lake level that used to be there. It was a giant, massive lake. And so even the seasons looked different than they do now. I don't think winter was cold, and I don't think summer was hot back that long ago, because the planets and the sun were in a different position, and the tilt of the earth is, has been changing. So, through all this time, the people survived because they adapted. So this isn't our first rodeo. I think also, yeah, they were the original scientists, like I said. The ability to adapt over millennia, over thousands of years, requires paying very close attention and documenting changes. We didn't document changes on paper. We had stories and oral traditions and songs and art and cultures and ceremony and way of life that encapsulated our knowledge about how to live and how things change. And so adaptations. Some tribes built water harvesting earthworks, and this is a great solution that we can learn from permaculture. Some tribes in the Southwest harvested water for their crops and traditional ceremonies in water harvesting rocks that they placed near the mesas. I had the honor of being able to be allowed to visit one of these rocks one time. And tribes in the Owens Valley in California, in the Eastern Sierra, built water harvesting swales to catch and store water flowing down from the mountain into the valley. And then also, tribes would pick up and move when things were no longer livable. And this is something that, as modern people, I think we can really learn from. We can expect with climate change to see more erratic storms, different types of storm patterns, more flooding events, more drought and desertification, and shifting coastlines as we lose our polar ice. And unfortunately, in our modern communities, when we suffer disaster, it's often the response to rebuild. We somehow tie this to our concept of recovery and resilience. We're gonna fight and nature's not gonna win. Well, I have news for you. Nature always wins. And so we can really learn from this when it's time to think about migrating into places that are habitable, and this brings up a whole different layer of questions around, political issues and human rights. But tribes have been adapting on Turtle Island for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. So I think we should call on their expertise now as we face climate change together.
Thank you, Carmen. Next, let's hear from Penny.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, Carmen, you sparked also when you were talking about the lake in Nevada. I was remembering Lake Tulare, which took up almost 5% of the state of California. It was this huge lake that they drained for whatever reason, I guess to get grazing land or farmland or whatever, but they drained this ginormous lake. And in California, that's the territory I'm mostly familiar with, even though I live in Washington now, but there used to be all year rain prior to 1906 in California. And what happened in 1906? They went and clear cut from Santa Cruz to Eureka to rebuild San Francisco, and then also develop all around the Bay Area. And so they took out the forests, they took out the rain. So, and I love, Carmen, that you mentioned about the adaptability of Indigenous people. That is so true. And that was the circle in Hawaii. I made a friend that was about that, is like the capacity for Indigenous people to adapt is amazing. We have so much to learn. So, you know, people have maintained their way of life for thousands of years, like it has been mentioned before. And after the Euro invasions, everyone has been impacted by colonization and ecosystem destruction, everybody. But Native Americans and Indigenous people have been affected the most. The majority of the world's biodiversity lies in the territories of Indigenous people. And they have Indigenous people have a wide variety of experiences that science is just beginning to catch up to include in its research for climate change and potential solutions. So as a result of this inclusion, the concepts of traditional ecological knowledge that Carmen mentioned and the practices are increasingly respected and considered in scientific research now, which is amazing. And what I'm also finding that across the board, the Native American communities are stepping up to restore their ecosystems, to help maintain their health and their cultural way of life. And so I can't even express the gratitude that I have for the people that are doing that. I mean, just look at what happened with Standing Rock and, you know, being fiercely defending of the waters and the earth. So, yeah.
Thank you, Penny. And Charlie, you mentioned the Euro invasion in a previous question, but do you have any other thoughts about adaptations in our communities?
Oh, sure. Oops, I turned off my camera. Sorry. My little, when I'm on my laptop, it's so sensitive. So Native Americans have been adapting very quickly. And I've lived most of my life in California, even though I'm native to New Mexico. I'm a descendant of the Towa people. I think I forgot to mention in my introduction. So I did grow up with an early childhood in the deserts. And I saw that my sister, who lived most of her life in Albuquerque, is on this call. So thank her for coming and joining us today. But Native Americans, so I'm speaking specifically to California, we've adapted very quickly because we're still in the early stages. The Euro invasions occurred in California just since the 1850s, so just a little over 150 years ago. Mostly what we're doing as an organization, as a tribal organization in Napa Valley, is we worked at the political aspect to make changes. We're focused a lot of the last decade on policy work. And that's an adaptation because that involves computers and papers and intellectual stuff, and then making our way into the tables where those decisions are being made. And I took a personal commitment that I was not going to be on the streets protesting. I wanted to be at the table where decisions were being made. And I always talk of, you know, every bureaucracy, every agency, whether it's a college or a religion or whatever it is, I say every king has its kingdom. And so when you come to the kingdom, you have to find a way to petition the king. So I see that as a canoe. You know, I just kept paddling my canoe, asking questions, how to get to the table. And fortunately, I've had the good fortune to be invited and appointed to several statewide boards and influence changes at the state level the last 15 years. And I've been really grateful for that. We're now affiliated with a Native American organization that did the same thing. They kind of headhunted me. They found me. I'm aligned with them, California Indian Environmental Alliance, and having that same vision of having a Native American tribal representative at every table, every decision that is being made at the state, county, and regional levels around water, forest management, fire mediation, all of those things. And we are actively working. We've actually, some of the work I did, and then of course the tribes working collectively at their own levels to demand from the governor to be at the tables around water and forest management. And we're now finally doing that. That's just been in the last 2 years. But Governor Brown, at the end of his tenure, he said he created a state policy that every state agency has to have memorandums of consultation with their tribes in their region. And that's really important language in their region, means that the areas where the tribes were terminated or exterminated, those are government terms, that there still are tribes in the region that must be consulted. Now that we're actually getting tribes and tribal organizations to those decision-making tables or meetings or organizations, and I won't even give you the acronyms. That's like a different language. Irwin, whatever they are, it just goes on and on. CPUC, PUC. So you have to learn that language, but we are now, is tribal representation. And what the tribes are asking for, we're creating a really, really strong coalition in the entire state to make sure that every region has those tribal liaisons. I push the CPUC and PG&E, all the utility companies, that they must, this took 11 years of very intense work, they must have full-time paid tribal liaisons in their agencies to deal with the tribes. That person must be a California native, must be a person who's familiar with the state and national levels of Indian law and Indian process. And now with the tribes, now that more and more the tribes are getting to these tables, what they're saying is, well, we've been consulted, but then they disregard it. It's like they check the box. Well, we talked to the tribes and they said this and that, but that wasn't possible. So we are going to proceed. But now the tribes are saying, no, we have to be the final word in the consultation or the actions. And that is being put into policy at the state level, and that's affecting county and cities. Of course, we have to advocate at the county and city levels that those statewide policies get implemented, just like we're advocating at the local levels that these international agreements between nations get implemented at the cities, the villages, and the towns where we're living. So that's an adaptation. The Native Americans not speaking the language, it was my grandparents that lost their language, that got displaced, and we were forcefully assimilated. So I'm a third generation removed from that. And then to learn the language and to understand how this industrialized mental invaders are working in order really to, put our Trojan horses, get in there. So it was a real honor when I got appointed to some of these boards, because I felt like, oh, they let me in. And then, just to never stay silent. So this kind of work that I'm describing is being replicated in the West Coast. Oregon and Washington are also following and creating similar policies. Washington has already done that, where they've put that requirement that all of the agencies monitoring water, forest, fish, wildlife, all of that, CAL FIRE, have to have liaisons and consultations with the tribes in their regions. Susquehanna Tribal has also been an active power, part of these policy changes, and strategizing with coalitions and tribes and like-minded government agencies. We have, fortunately here in Napa County, we have a very proactive resource conservation district, RCD they're referred to, and they're helping us with funding and also to influence leadership at the national levels through the USDA, United States Department of Agriculture, which is just amazing. So we also align ourselves. I know we're doing these cohorts educating about the historical trauma, and this is the cohort we're in right now. Everybody was apologizing because they were like, I work with the government. I said, yeah, but it's great that you're here. Let's be allies. And those were people that are all allied with us. But for the first time ever, and this is the biggest change I think that's occurred since the European invasions, is the Department of Interior, the current president, appointed a Native American woman who is a member of a federally recognized tribe, Deborah Havlin, a tribal member of Laguna Pueblo. She's a woman from a matrilineal tribe, was appointed to the U.S. Department of Interior. That was the federal agency that was responsible in the formation of the U.S. government to killing Indians. So 400 years later, to have a Native American woman in charge of that department, we're seeing massive, and again, that's a massive adaptation to be in charge of the organization that was killing you and killing our ancestors. So that was they were responsible for the forced relocations of the past century. And so now we've got this really incredible, strong woman. And so I refer back to what I said earlier about that balance between masculine and feminine. The divine feminine is emerging in these matrilineal women and changing the relationship of Earth from that extractive predator to the relationship of respect and cohabitation with all sentient life on this earth. So that's my wrap on adaptation.
Thank you, Charlie. Awesome. In just a few minutes, we're going to start the Q&A. So start, thinking about what questions you have for our panelists. But we're going to have one last real short question. We've talked about a lot here, and I think a lot of people are learning so much. But real quick, it's been said that it's time to refocus science data collection on what is working, not just how it's getting worse and worse. What can the world learn from Native Americans about solutions to the climate emergency? And we'll start off with Charlie this time.
Okay, this is my favorite question. Again, we collectively created these questions, but Carmen was really the one who put us to such a profound level of having really good questions, because you can't have the right answer without the right question. So our Native American elders, again, I'm referring to California elders that I've worked with, because I've lived in California since 1958. And all of my adult life has been spent in Napa Valley. Ron Good is a tribal elder from the Mono people in Central Valley, and he says to us every square inch of California and probably all of North America was touched by human hands. There was a close symbiotic relationship was maintained for tens of thousands of years. The ancestral knowledge is being revived, and through the policy changes I described earlier, the Earth stewardship is being restored to tend the Mother Earth with respect and spiritual consciousness that all life is connected. What the tree people breathe out, the two-leggeds breathe in. What the two-leggeds breathe out, the tree people breathe in. The tree people call the rains from the skies. They hold the water that falls to the earth to replenish the underground rivers and the above ground rivers and the oceans. All life is connected. A movement is a global movement to declare a global moratorium on deforestation, to convert to sustainable fuels and construction materials like hemp and bamboo. Everything that we're using, oil and forest and trees, paper, fuel, all of that could be met with hemp and bamboo products. Winona LaDuke, I just have to mention her. She's like the hero of our generation, Ojibwe global elder from Minnesota. She's been a global leader since I met her in Beijing in 1995. She continues to talk at the UN level, at federal levels, and her local state level, her tribe in Minnesota. She is really sharing all of her knowledge and progress via social media, YouTube, and public lectures at the UN and all around the world. And that's that conversion to hemp and bamboo to replace the oil fuels. That could happen in 5 years with public will. And there are countries that are doing that right now. So.
Thank you, Charlie. Penny, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I just want to thank you, Charlie. Those are great words and stories. Yeah, I like the idea of bringing, the humans back as a keystone species. And for people who don't know what a keystone species is, it's like we regard all species as keystone species, but it's a species like the salmon or the oak tree that if that species were to disappear, there would be a profound level of collapse. And what's happened is the human has been removed from the ecosystem. And I'm thinking about cultural burning, in California, for example, or just the way the people have maintained the fisheries up here in the Snohomish, Salish territory, and how there's been this reciprocal relationship between the salmon, singing the salmon back, the salmon singers, and hearing and experiencing the salmon responding to those songs and how important these cultural practices are, and that they're still being, it's not like Carmen said, it's not something that is in the past. It's still happening now and will continue to happen. And I think really what I'm seeing, what I'm witnessing too among tribal peoples is they're really educating themselves, not only like with permaculture education, but also things like groundwater recharge systems, and how to restore the fisheries and how, really not forgetting how interconnected the cycle of life is, so, when you dam a river, you're going to be taking away the salmon's capacity to move upstream. I mean, Indigenous people have known this forever, but now people are starting to listen. And to Charlie, you're being invited into all these agencies and that. And I just was thinking about, there's like the National Congress of American Indians that was established in like 2018 to help mitigate climate change impacts in tribes in Washington state. But there's a lot of effort. There's another one called the International Indigenous Peoples Forum on Climate Change. And these are designed to help educate the federal leaders on the impacts of climate change, particularly on tribal people and Indigenous people, Native Americans. But what happens to Indigenous people happens to everybody. We are all impacted. So as the conditions for Indigenous people improve, so will it improve for non-Indigenous people, for everybody, because when those conditions improve for Indigenous people, it means that the earth is being restored. It means that things are coming back. It means that the health of the water and the earth and the ecosystem and the plants and the insects and the animals are starting to thrive again, because that's what it's going to take for all of us to be able to thrive. So deep gratitude to everybody, especially on this panel, but all the people that have been working on earth restoration throughout the years. And lastly, I just want to make one more thing. There was a conference a few years ago called the Global Earth Repair Conference. And it was Indigenous people from all over, including like Inuit and Lakota and South America and Peru. And people they were holding front and center at that conference. And it was probably the best conference I've ever been to, ever, in terms of the learning and the exchange of earth repair solutions. So it's happening. We got this.
Thank you, Penny. And before we go into our Q&A, Carmen, can we hear from you about what the world can learn from us about solutions to the climate emergency?
Yeah, thank you. I really want to echo what Charlie was talking about, the importance of changing laws and policy, engaging with governments and decision makers, and becoming part of those governments and decision makers ourselves. I really want to give a shout out to Deb Haaland and the great work that she's doing. And more tribal people are stepping up, and we have the benefit of rich traditional ecological knowledge and all the wonderful things that we can learn from modern science, working in combination. And it's just such a exciting and powerful time for Native people, not only to be on panels of consulting when something's happening, but to be at the forefront of making decisions about how we're going to move forward. So definitely want to encourage all the youth out there who are interested in learning to learn about these wonderful practical things we could do, and learn the science about how we could show how it's working, because that's one of the gaps that we have right now. Scientists, speaking as a scientist myself, I'm guilty. I've been stuck in analysis paralysis, where I just, at the end of the report, my entire result says I need more data. I can't do anything. I can't make a decision. I'm totally frozen. I need more data. Well, the fact is, I don't need any more data to know what to do right. We have solutions. We have things that work. We can use some help filling in the gaps for the science that supports what's working, because we have tons of science on what's not working. So that's something I think that could be useful. I want to talk a little more about something I mentioned previously, the Owens Valley in California. This is one of the most inspiring examples that comes to mind when I think about the work tribes have done and what we can learn moving forward. So the Owens Valley is in eastern California, kind of in between Yosemite and Death Valley. It follows the eastern side of the Sierra mountain range. And the Paiute people have been there for thousands of years. Don't know how many, but not exactly. Many, 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 many thousands of years probably. And they call that valley Payahunadu in their language. That means the land of flowing water. If you were to go visit the Owens Valley today, it's right next to Death Valley. There's no flowing water anymore. It's you'll see a lot of desert, a lot of dry, parched land, enormous dust problems. There's a huge playa, a giant dry lake bed. That dry lake, it used to be a lake. It used to be Owens Lake. And the land used to be so rich with water that the tribe literally named the valley the land of flowing water, Payahunadu. So in 1913, not that long ago, the neighbors to the south, also known as the city of Los Angeles, completed the construction of the LA Aqueduct. This is an aqueduct that takes water from the Owens Valley, and they used all these mule teams to build this aqueduct, and it takes the water from the Owens Valley to LA to supply LA with their part of their water needs. We know that some of their water is also imported from the Colorado River, creating impacts, especially for my tribe, the Navajo tribe, and many other tribes in the Southwest. This year, there were ranchers that couldn't plant their crops because there was just no water. And then also the Central Valley in California. And ripples, water creates ripples. So all of these impacts have other impacts that just stack on. So the Owens Lake was drained very quickly to supply Los Angeles with the water it needed to grow into the metropolis it is today. And I had the pleasure of meeting and learning from a man, the late Harry Williams, a Paiute from the Owens Valley. And he came across these earthen structures on the landscape. He spent a lot of time on the land and found these earthen structures in the valley. These structures are what we call in permaculture swales. I'm not sure what the Paiute people called them. I would love to know what the original people called these structures. But swales are man-made earthwork structures, and they can harvest massive amounts of water that falls as rain, and it helps the water sink into the ground. And it replenishes groundwater aquifers, and that in turn feeds the flowing streams. It allows the streams to flow all year round, and not just when there's like snow melt coming off the mountain. And as you know, both rainfall and snowpacks are being impacted by climate change. So I was invited to come down to the Owens Valley to work on a project with the Big Pine Paiute tribe. And it was a project to reconstruct swales in the exact same place that they had been built by the ancestors thousands of years ago. And it was a place that was known historically to be a tribal garden. But after the water was removed, there was no garden. Well, there is a garden again to this day. And those swales are harvesting water, helping the tribe to grow food. They have a beautiful food sovereignty program and farmers market. So it's providing economic opportunity and food and community and water harvesting and recharging the groundwater. And this is exciting. This is exciting for many reasons, but this is why it's exciting to me. We have evidence that shows that we can create man-made features like swales that make the land more water rich. Without swales, dusty, dry desert. With swales, Payahunadu, land of flowing water. When we talk about climate change and the impacts of climate change and the human impact on the earth, we always think of the extremely negative things that humans have done that have caused this problem. But we also have the ability to do equally positive things as humans on this planet. And so that's exciting to me. And we have evidence, we have proof of it working for thousands of years. So yeah, I think that we can learn from that, and we really need to see more of that everywhere with the increasing water instability, drought, and desertification that is happening and being exacerbated by climate change.
Thank you so much, Carmen, for that wonderful example. We're going to go into our Q&A session right now. So I'm going to repeat the questions that I see coming through. If you have a question, put it in the Q&A chat, and I will read it off and allow our panelists to answer as they see fit. So,
Marianne, say the chat, because Q&A, those are two different places.
okay.
People put their questions in the chat.
Put your questions in the chat. All right, we already have one question, so let's go. Is there traditional tribal knowledge that can help with the growing problem of water scarcity in the US West? For instance, would reforestation help, and would it be possible under the current arid conditions? Are there native ideas about water consumption that might help? And I think Carmen just spoke to this, but you just unmute yourself and start talking. I won't call on anybody.
Well, I really want to put Penny on the spot here because I gave you my little bit on the Owens Valley, but Penny has some global knowledge, and she is also my teacher. So take it away, Penny.
Okay. Yeah, well, you know, ditto what you said, Carmen. Swales, groundwater recharge, taking all that runoff, because what's happened is from overgrazing and logging, and anytime you have heavy equipment or large animals walking around on clay soil when it's wet, it compacts it. And then when it dries, the water can't sink in anymore. So basically when it rains, I've seen it when it's been raining for a month and you dig down 6 inches and it's bone dry in those hills. So by digging these contour ditches and doing what the Paiute were doing in the Owens Valley to infiltrate that water and recharge the groundwater is really key. And also another thing that we haven't talked about that's happening is called saltwater intrusion in all of the coastal communities because everybody's sucking water out with wells and they're not replenishing the water because it's all running to the sea and storm drains. And, you know, when there's development with concrete everywhere and the water can't refeed the earth again, then now there's salt water entering into the wells and the water is not becoming less drinkable. So the solution is simply putting in those swales. And that will also help hydrate the earth enough to be able to support reforestation and support trees without irrigation. And so, yeah, and I just, when you were talking about Paiute, when I was there, you know, Monty, Monty, our friend Monty, he said, maybe it's a good thing they took our water. And we were all kind of going like, what? And he says, yeah, because if they hadn't have taken their water, what would the Owens Valley look like now? It would probably either be agricultural hell, or it would look like Palm Desert or like some kind of development. And so what it brought forward for me was the notion of everybody just kind of gestating and just kind of waiting. and holding center until the time can come when those waters can come back to the Owens Valley again. And so what's there now is native plants that have adapted to that environment, and which is probably better than what would have been had they just taken the water and developed that land. Anyway, I love your perspective on that, Carmen.
So I wanted to
Also-
add to that.
I'm
Oops,
sorry, go ahead.
I was just turning on my microphone. That's our signal that we're about to speak, is turn on the microphone. But what California elders had said, that when the Euro invasions happened, the first thing they did was cut the largest, biggest trees in the forest. And those ancient trees that are actually thousands and thousands of years old, that's when the dying of the forest occurred. And so Mother Earth is actually healing herself. The firestorms, the extreme firestorms we've been having in California the last 5 and 6 years, that's actually the Earth healing herself. A lot of those storms were created by lightning. The microbials, the beneficial microbials in the soul, are what call the lightning from the sky. And when the lightning touches the Earth, those are bringing microbial spores from the stars and putting them in the Earth. The fires that have started and those intense temperatures are what is needed for those ancient, multi-thousand-year-old trees that are gone from California. It allows them to regenerate. And so the worst thing that we can do is replant the forests. But the solution is being offered, and the indigenous people are at the tables offering this, is that we have to allow the forest to grow and be, again, tending by hand, which are those identifying those ancient heart trees. They're the heart of the forest. So we killed the heart of the mother. The mother's been in, decline since then, the Euro invasions of California. And now with these intense fires, those seeds are being generated. It's a healing crisis. So the worst thing to do is to replant. We have to allow the ancient seeds to grow and flourish again so that life can return to balance that existed for the thousands of years we keep talking about. And so also the swales, we're doing all that stuff, but we are also just kind of watching the Earth heal herself, sitting back a little bit and still hand pulling. Again, the Yurok, the Humboldt tribes, the Yurok, the Karuk, and the Hupa, that's what they've been saying for about 30 years in California. Let us touch the Earth like we did. Let us take care of the state like we did. And that's not spraying or poisoning, but hand pulling, hand weeding. And there are young teams of California natives throughout the state that are trained, ready, and willing to do that. Okay.
Thank you. That question was from Susan Lee. Thank you, Susan, for that question. We've got two more. The next one is from Manu Sheehan. I hope I pronounced that right. The question is, can you speak more about the unique strengths that Native American women contribute to leading the efforts in this response to climate crisis? Go ahead, whoever wants to take that.
Women are the ones leading everything that we're talking about. Obviously, we're all women, and we are the ones leading. I referred back to Deborah Havilon, but in the matrilineal tribes of California and New Mexico, I think the Lakota, the really harsh region of the United States, were patrilineal, but I think that most of the tribes were matrilineal. And when you look into the tribal governments now, it is almost all, predominantly, or at least 50-50, they're women. And we could list all the names of those women. I think between me and Carmen and Penny, we could come up, and Marianne, we could come up with lots of names, but just know that all the changes and things that we're talking about is mostly women-led, matrilineal.
One thing that comes to mind is Native women are fierce. And I think we need some fierce leadership right now. Sometimes I think about the fierceness that comes through when you love someone. Like if you have a child who's about to run into the street, we can be gentle about it and say, dear, please don't run into the street. Or we can say, stop, don't run into the street, get back here. we have this ability to come with fierce love. And I think that's a little of what the world needs right now.
What I find refreshing among my Indigenous women friends is there's like basically zero tolerance for BS. You know, it just doesn't like there's like little d. Anybody who's you know, there's finely honed. And I've talked to non-native people that are going in trying to help Indigenous people, and I'm like, what's your motivation? You know, you got to get wicked honest if you're going to work with Indigenous people, because they're going to know your game and they're going to see it immediately, especially the women. So just want to add that.
Thank you. And the last question that at least that I have now is from Judy Toledo Lopez. The question is, what is the biggest obstacle in the way of a move towards sustainability, and how might that be overcome?
Hey, sister, you got to come and help your sister. You know, if we stick together in strong families, that's my sister, and she was one of the first women firefighters in the state of California, and she was about to be one of the first forest rangers, women forest rangers in the state of California. What was that? Back in the mid 1980s, but she made a decision to join her now husband and move back to Albuquerque and raise her children there. But I kind of changed my background. I don't know how to get it so my head's there, but this is the star people. I don't know if you can see that, but this is an Aboriginal painting from Australia that I was gifted when I returned from Beijing, because the experiences I had with the Aboriginal tribes that were present there, the women, there were 13 women, which of course 13 is the cosmic number of creation and female power, the 13 moons, the 13 latitudes, blah, blah, blah. But I just was hearing this story yesterday. That's what had us laughing so much, was that the star people came down from the stars. And again, this is from a person who I can't mention his name because unfortunately people are still trying to kill him, but he's the one with the oral tradition of 30,000 years of the Americas, North and South America. And he tells the stories about when the star people came from the Seven Sisters, which is the Pleiades, where we believe the two-leggeds came from, that these snakes came from the stars, and they are what forms the rivers. And this is a star map. Most of the Aboriginal paintings are star maps. They know how to travel, not just through the rivers and oceans on this earth, but through the cosmos. So when these snakes come, they liked it here on the earth and they wanted to stay. And 2 of them were allowed to stay. And in gratitude to the two-leggeds for letting them remain here on this earthly plane, this 3rd dimension, they have that promise of sending those spores, you know, what we call magic mushrooms or psilocybin, that those are spores that come from the stars to the earth with the lightning. So that medicine is the food of the first people. That's the gift from the star people to the earth, for us to use that medicine to recall our ancestral memory, to remember why our spirits descended to this earthly plane. What was the promise your spirit was making upon entering this 3rd dimension, upon incarnation of this lifetime? The lizard people, you know, for the Aboriginal people, before we had these incredible wires and technology and stuff, we used to communicate through the lizards. And some of us still can do that. The lizard people were the telephone network around the earth, but they also, you see in this picture, they're communicating through the stars to the snakes, to the lizards. Those are the ones that keep their belly on the ground. They're like a telegraph that sends messages around the earth and then to the stars and from the stars. The earth is being fed by billions of tons of cosmic dust every day. When we talk about the sun being a living being, when I was giving this presentation in high school a long time ago, talking about the sun as a living being, the earth as a living being, which of course, you know, 30 years ago in a high school, Western high school, it was pretty foreign. The kids were like revolting on me, seniors. And one woman said, well, if you're saying that the sun is alive, what does the sun eat? And I didn't know the answer, but I just asked, you know, my ancestors, what does the sun eat? And I heard that just like the whale is the largest thing in the ocean, eating and surviving on the smallest thing in the ocean, that microscopic plankton, so is the sun, so are the star people, the largest things in this cosmic sea of darkness, the grandmother of all things. And they are fed, and what they eat is that stardust. The same stardust that feeds the earth. That's what feeds the sun. The sun, the stars are in constant consumption. You know, I always think if they're blowing up, you know, how the sun is the light and heat is this continual hydrogen bonds, basically. What keeps the sun together? It's a consciousness holding that incredible energy of creation into matter. And what's feeding it is the stardust, the same thing that feeds the earth and all the planets. That stardust is being dumped billions of tons every day. I thought the dust came from the skin or something, but it's actually coming to the earth. And then when lightning brings those mushroom spores and brings them to regenerate the earth, it's for us. It's a gift to the two-leggeds to remember what our promise was. So what we can do to accelerate the healing that we're describing is to do that. Eat the medicine. Take the journey. Remember where you came from and why you came to this earth. Come on, sis, you know it's me.
Nice, Charlie. That's beautiful. One of the things what your words brought up for me is who decides what's living and what's not living? I mean, where did that come from? Like, is water alive? Of course it is. But by the definition of, you know, somebody made some definition of life, and then people in certain cultures signed on to that definition. And that doesn't necessarily mean it's correct, you know? So just saying.
Thank you. Thank you to all of you. I cannot express how thrilling it is to be in your expertise and your genius, and you're just wonderful. Every one of you. And so with the few minutes that we have left, I wanted to throw it out there to the panel. Just whatever closing remarks you have, 1.5 minutes from your end on what, you know, what's positive about the situation that we're in now. Whoever wants to talk, go ahead.
Well, I'd like to speak a little too, and this will be my closing remark as well, the barrier and the positive. Because that's how things work in permaculture. The problem is the solution. It's one of the things we like to say. So one of the barriers people will often throw out is money. It's so expensive. There's so many things to do, and we don't have the money to do it. The things we've been talking about, the solutions we've been talking about, the solutions permaculture brings forward, they're not expensive. Penny has a quote. Let me see if I can re-quote you a little. I don't know if I can do it accurately, but the problems are complex, but the solutions are embarrassingly simple.
That's actually a Mollison quote.
Oh, beautiful. Bill Mollison is the man who sort of coagulated permaculture and gave it a label from indigenous knowledge. But these things can be done not very expensively. I like to think about and time. Oh, we don't have enough time. Such a late hour. How are we gonna, you know, change the world? And it's too late. Well, in that case, I like to think about the work that was done in China in the Loess Plateau, where in literally several years, they took a degraded, desertified landscape and turned it into green. Look it up. There's a documentary about it. We can do this. We can do this quickly. And one of the greatest things that we need is human resources, people to do this. So many green jobs can be made available, a green economy in support of these very inexpensive things. The most expensive thing we have is human time, but we can do that. Data, analysis paralysis, no more. We don't need more data. We know what to do. We know what to do. We know what actions to take. The thing that is the barrier is our heart. We have to heal our own hearts and our own trauma so we can reconnect to the world around us and develop the great love it requires to act. That's all I have.
In my closing minutes, I want to give to our techie backup for them to put on the camera and say a few words. Milan and Robin helping us out through this.
Hello, everyone. I just want to say thank you to our panelists. I've really enjoyed hearing your perspective. I was excited because I had seen the questions ahead of time. So I was like, I cannot wait to hear what the responses are. And you did not disappoint. I'm feeling so invigorated, so optimistic, and just I trust that we're out here going to do the work. There is a sustainable future ahead of us. And yes, just lots of love to everyone, to all the attendees as well.
This is, I think, one of the best Zoom calls I've ever been on. I'm just so inspired, and what an honor it's been to watch this conversation unfold. And I hope the panelists had a chance to see some of the comments coming through on the chat. Folks have just been really engaged and inspired by everything that you've shared. Thank you for your work. Thank you for inspiring all of us to do our part.
Thank you all. We're at time right now. So I just wanted to thank once again, Penny Livingston, Carmen Gonzalez, Charlie Toledo, our tech team of Millen and Robin, and all of you in the audience for joining us. It's a privilege and an honor to be with you today. Have a good rest of your evening. Goodbye.